So, hello, my name is Thomas,
And I'm Jonas.
and this is Liquiditeam Live. So, if you're one of the people who have been really following us along the way for the first two episodes, you will wonder why is it Liquiditeam Live? I remember there was another name. It's true, we called this show initially PS the Internet. Look, I'm already forgetting the name of the show because it was so short-lived, but it occurred to us that it might make more sense to rebrand it, rename it. So now we are doing Liquiditeam Live. And of course, it's not only the two of us. We have a guest here, Michael, and he will be on screen in a second. For the first two episodes, you will wonder why is it. But now I get a bad echo. Just quick recap from before the tech issues. We rebranded to Liquiditeam Live. That is the most important info for you today. And instead of saying many words about Michael, whom we know for several months by now, I would suggest that Michael give us the very brief 5-sentence summary of who you are, what you've been doing in the sports industry before we dive deeper into other subjects.
Okay, welcome all. My name is Mike Clohisy, and I'm an attorney by trade. I've worked in the sports space for many years. I'm a licensed attorney, and I've worked for a large media, advertising, tech, and management consulting firm, Publicis Sapient. Prior to that, I was an attorney and a player agent in the NFL as a player agent for almost 15 years. So I have deep experience in the sports space, and most recently, I've joined a group here in Boston, a startup called Beasy, which is we're involved in the blockchain space and providing solutions, and I'm particularly focused on the sports space.
So cool. Thank you for the summary. I mean, there is so much stuff in your life that you've been doing that is very interesting, and especially interesting from the deep knowledge that you have of the many different sides of the sports business, which of course is for us at Liquiditeam very interesting, but also personally for me just a fascinating business and industry. So probably let's start here, because it's one of these worlds that many people probably don't have a good grasp on. How did you become a player agent, an NFL player agent?
So it's interesting. So I played sports most of my life. So I was blessed with having some athletic ability, and I played football and ran track in high school.
Which position did you play?
I was actually a tailback in high school, but I was 170 pounds, so that was too light to play at a higher division level. So because I was quite fast, and I was ranked here in the Northeast in the hurdles and some of the sprints, I was able to attract some attention purely on my speed. So at 5'11", 170 pounds, I suspect probably some recruiters suspected that I could probably gain a few pounds and be able to play wide receiver or defensive back. So I was never going to be a tailback at my size. So I guess just having sort of sports DNA pedigree, I migrated to going to college. I went to Boston College, played football there for 2 years, injured myself my sophomore year, and I was moved to wide receiver. Then I was moved to defensive back. Then I was moved to wide receiver. So I was part of the Boston College football team back in the 80s, and that was the era of Doug Flutie. So that was quite enjoyable. And my injury, when I injured my foot my sophomore year, that essentially ended my career. So fortunately for me, it was a blessing in disguise, because I discovered where the library was in Boston College. So I was able to finally crack some books and use the brain that God gave me, that I forgot that he gave me. So as a consequence to that, I sort of moved into some after Boston College, I moved into the banking world and worked in banking and finance, and then I moved to New York and started working for a mediation arbitration firm. And I worked for a particular judge that worked for the NFL, and he knew my background, so I'd have lunch with him every day. And he said, why don't you get into the sports space? Why don't you go to law school? Why don't you go to business school? So he sort of acted as my mentor. And so I shot off an email to an old close friend of mine now who ran the football division at a boutique sports agency in Boston called Bob Wolf Associates. And I accepted an internship, applied to law school, got into law school, and then found my way into a circle of about 5 or 6 interns and sort of separated myself from them and eventually became the agent's partner. And I loved it, and I found a passion for it. I felt it was something that I could really build a career on, and so I teamed up with this individual, and we were together for approximately 5 years.
I mean, without going too deep into the agent business, just I think it's a business everybody has at some point has some fantasies about that he or she would also be able to be a good agent. What is like the key skill that you realized you had to have to be a successful agent? Was it the relationship business and recruiting players when they are young and talking to their families, or is it more on the side of the sponsors and the deal making? What was like the key skill you learned?
I think you hit on all the touch points. I think it was really important to establish it. So relationship management is really a critical skill, but communication skills, I think you need to have no fear entering into that space. So because I played sports, I seem to relate to a number of the athletes. So that was a skill that I think was sort of ingrained into my DNA, but I also had to work at certain skills. So negotiation skills took a part, but also research skills. So researching contracts and really understanding what the particulars were with respect to the real contract issues at play. So with regards to the NFL, I mean, you know, when you get licensed, you have to sit for an exam. So you need to understand that quite well. You have to understand the collective bargaining agreement. So I was always a very good reader, and so I enjoyed the content, and I just enjoyed people. I think it was a relationship management exercise, and I enjoyed the recruiting as well.
And did you?
But when you're younger, I think you enjoy the recruiting. As you get older, it gets a little taxing, but it helped certainly enhance some of my skill set. Certainly getting out there and recruiting and traveling quite a bit, which I did when I was younger. So.
Did you work with scouts to do the recruiting and that tipped you on talents, or was it something you did by yourself mostly, going to college games, figuring out who to onboard?
I think it was a relationship building exercise on many different fronts. So I built relationships with scouts in the NFL. So that's a great point, Jonas. So I was able to cultivate and nurture relationships on the scouting side. So many of the same scouts that I became friendly with back then were entry-level scouts into the NFL who are now working in front offices in the NFL. So it's a pretty close-knit group of individuals, but sharing the knowledge and then also participating and working through some of the scouts and really understanding the deep domain subject matter knowledge of who the players were. So I had a particular eye for it. I think that helped. And also playing the game, I think, was very helpful as well. But I think really I owe a lot to several friends that were entry-level scouts that went on to become very prominent scouts and are now sitting in front office positions in the NFL as well as team presidents and general managers. So they were truly skilled, and they taught me a lot. So it was a work in progress, but it was a fun journey, and I enjoyed the content. I enjoyed the subject matter. So it was a natural, seamless ride for me.
Were all your clients NFL or football players, or did you also work in other sports, basketball, baseball, hockey?
Also, we had some clients that were also in the collective. In the Canadian Football League as well. So there's 2 primary leagues here. There's the Arena League as well, which is another league in the U.S. But for the most part, we were primarily an NFL-centric sports agency with a number of clients. We were fortunate enough to build a nice client base, and I'm proud of what we accomplished, and we assembled quite a group of some players that went on to have some really good prominence in the NFL. So that built the foundation for me to sort of build on later as the individual that I worked for went on to become general counsel and worked in a senior front office position in the NFL. So it's a rather small insular world, but
you have to break in at some point. If you don't get to break in, it's very hard to establish yourself. But once you are inside, I think if you're doing a good job, and if you are good at relationship building, trust building, plus doing a good job, then I think it's also, I don't know, fraternity kind of almost.
It's a fraternity word, yeah.
So that was one angle, and then just to give our listeners some background of what you are doing and how you can really cover the sports sector from different angles. Probably also tell us a bit about your time at Publicis. Probably people, when you told me first about Publicis, because I actually at one point in my life studied public relations, mostly thought about Publicis as a PR agency. However, as you then enlightened me, they have really changed and became almost a digital strategy focused player, or at least had a branch. So you went into a different area of the sports market. Is that a fair summary? Of course, elaborate, please.
That's a very fair assessment and summary. In fact, I'd say, so Publicis is one of the probably 2, 3, 4 largest from the genesis of their origins. They they are an advertising company, one of the largest 2 or 3 in the world, WPP, IPG. So they're a very prominent company, and like many of the others, similar. I would contrast it with probably some of the management consulting firms. So some of the big accounting firms like EY, PwC, KPMG, who were actually partnered with Beasy, and Deloitte. And so some of them, as many have shifted their business models, so did Publicis. So as an advertising firm that was really prominently 1, 2, or 3, depending on who you ask, they're Paris-based. They acquired a company that I had originally started with and for called Sapient, which was a US company that was more tech solution oriented and also probably slanted towards management consulting. So I think they saw the forest through the trees, and I think they saw the vision of where I think the marketplace was heading. So as a consequence, similar to, I'd say, again, I think a similar contrast to some of the big accounting firms. And that's primarily where most of the business initiatives that I was involved with had to do with management consulting, and also, so I was a business development, although I'm an attorney by trade, just driving business and relationship management. So it was pretty easy for me to assimilate. And we were also trying to build out a sports vertical as well. So there were some media. It's a very strong media company as well, with a suite of tremendous stable of brands. So it's quite prominent. So leveraging those in the advertising space, but as well as digital transformation and the OTT and the platform, the digital OTT space, and just being a part of that journey and learning a lot about technology while I was there, because I was prior, while I was a player agent, I also transitioned. I was also working at a law firm for a little while. And I was doing mostly conventional transactional work, real estate, corporate, while I was also a player agent. So I was also handling some contracts for some executives and some coaches. And so once I landed at Publicis, I was, Sapient actually, and then Sapient was purchased by Publicis back in 2015, perhaps.
Is that the time we're talking about? So yes. What were some of the topics and the technological trends at the time that you were looking at?
I think a lot of it was digital transformation, as you noted. So the trend was really shifting in that direction. So there was quite a bit of tech savvy folks there, and some powerful horsepower, and some senior executives that saw the vision. A lot of it was data analytics as well. So I think prior to perhaps the wave of data privacy issues that we've talked about separately, I think back then, I think a lot of it was data analytics and data management, but also acquiring data and how to shape the digital world in the sense of converging with advertising and allowing publicists to leverage and have relationships with large brands as well as large enterprises and also banks and institutions, which I worked closely with an individual that ran that, who was a friend of mine. And he was just a tremendous resource and a very good friend of mine and a very good person to learn from. And so he was handling a lot of clients and built up his client base in the financial services sector. So a lot of banks, institutions, many of the largest A-list first-in-class banks, hedge funds in the world. So I was sort of wedged in the middle of some of those engagements. And I think I just, in one mouth, as my old partner and boss, Jack Mueller, who gave me a break in the business, told me, you're born with two ears and one mouth, and he echoed the words of my grandfather. So it was really interesting to sort of learn, and I think that was part of the journey at Publicis, learning a lot and integrating myself into a tech world where I was quite gun shy actually going into it on the tech space because I really didn't know a lot about the tech world. So it was great experience for me being there for 4+ years.
What was like the most interesting insight you had when you came into the tech space? Because I basically grew up in it, but you came from a different world. So were there any differences in terms of how the people are? Is the mentality super different? Is the way of working super different? Or what were like the things you realized after a while hanging around with more tech people?
I think it was, well, first of all, I worked with a lot of extremely bright people and a lot of creative types. So there was quite assembly of talent that Publicis and Sapient had within their stable. So I was fortunate enough to work closely with a lot of those folks and learn quite a bit. But I think the key was the digital transformation, if I had to summarize it, but also the real rise of the importance of data. And I know data now is just sort of a household word, but I think data is so important in everything we do in any commercial enterprise, including some of the sports initiatives that we're doing now, but also some of the engagements we were involved in then, and really understanding the consumer and really understanding the behavioral trends. So essentially, in some ways, gathering data trends and understanding how to shape the advertising and corporate sponsorship and marketing space in a way that companies and enterprises and banks and institutions and healthcare institutions and automotive and travel and tourism. So there are many verticals that were very prominent within the suite of services within Publicis. Just sort of getting in the middle of all that and understanding how data played such a central role in all of that. That was critical.
Cool. So maybe that is a good segue to the first. So as advertised, we want to talk about trends in the sports industry and important trends in the sports industry. And there is a lot going on, as you probably already showed when you were just talking about the first insights you had at your time at Publicis. So what would be interesting for starters for us, if you could tell us what in your opinion are the three main trends that you currently see that you expect will really change the sports industry, the sports business going forward, and then we will deep dive into all of these for starters.
So that's something I've thought about, and we've had a number of these conversations prior to this, and I think it's been more blockchain centric. But I'd have to say that, and forgive me if I don't limit it to three, but I think there's sort of an
please limit it to three for now, the main ones.
So what I see is number one, I think eSports there's a meteoric rise of eSports, especially given COVID right now. I think there's been increased emphasis on gaming because people are indoors. So I think you're going to see that particular, I'd call it a sport. I think you're going to see that gain in popularity. It's already a global, very popular global sport, and I think because of COVID, it's going to shift the paradigm, and I think the metrics already support it. I've done a deep dive into this research, and so I think esports is number one.
What's number two?
I think blockchain is definitely number two. I just think it's just everything is going digital now, and I think data, the convergence of data as well, and data privacy, and so all the components involving blockchain, the value of blockchain, having sort of a decentralized ledger system, the applications for it in use cases are immense. The opportunities are out there, whether it's in sports or whether any other use cases, which we've explored tremendously. We've talked about it, but also in other verticals, every vertical it actually applies to. So I certainly think blockchain is certainly one as well. I'd say the third one, I'll limit it to probably, I'd say 5G, actually. It's a tie between 5G and digital currencies, but I'd go with 5G. I think that's going to be a big transformational technology.
We can already plug the digital currencies into the blockchain realm, so then we're at 3.
So it's a subset.
Yeah. I agree. That is a fair thing. Okay, cool. So probably to look a bit systematically at these 3 trends. If we start with your first pick, esports, then I would be curious to see what is your vision. Why do you think esports is going to change the sports landscape so vividly? And probably to make it even more concrete, do you think the influence is going to be more to the extent that people will flock towards, especially young people flock towards esports, and I don't know, stop watching whatever baseball maybe? Or do you think it's going to be more an influence coming from how these esports deal with their audiences, and this will influence how traditional sports will behave and reach their audiences?
I think it's a demographic issue. I also think it's a paradigm shift. So the times, in some ways, have forced the change, and I think so if you focus on the individuals that are participating in the esports space, most of the players that are involved are younger. So I believe, if my statistics are correct, I think the majority of prominent esports players are between the ages of 16, 17, and say 21 and 22 for the professional type players, for the very, very good players. But from a recreational standpoint, you have such a massive appetite. So you have a lot of kids that have grown up with mobile devices at their fingertips. And so I think it was a natural assimilation into that world. And I think gaming was part of it. I think, from my experience, just seeing a bunch of kids throughout my life playing on video games, I think once they gravitated and saw the appetite and saw the opportunities to, it was fun. It's actually fun. I don't particularly play esports or gaming myself, but and I frankly, in the beginning, I was somewhat cynical about it. But as I started to research the area more extensively, I realized that this is just a growth area that's exponential growth over the next 4, 5, 10 years. In fact, I read the statistics, and in fact, I think I heard this actually. A good friend of mine on one of his podcasts. He works for Sport Radar. He has a great podcast, the betting podcast. Jake Williams from Sport Radar, I think a guest on one of his shows indicated that the esports space right now is probably somewhere in the range of 9th or 10th or 11th in terms of its popularity. And this particular guest supported it with the data. I don't have the data, but suggested that it's probably going to move into somewhere between 4 or 5, somewhere in the pecking order of at least
compared to other sports, or
compared to other sports. So you see the demographic.
But then it's a bit unfair, no? Because esports is a category, and you have many different esports. Like you have the FIFA players, League of Legends, Dota, and these are all different esports, right? It's like saying, okay, it's all sports are sports. baseball, football is one. So I think that it's a bit of an shaky comparison to make. Even though, of course, it shows the impact, and I mean, I have a certain affinity to looking at things from the perspective of the attention economy and how attention has become this rare thing that people really have to spend between all the content that is available. And depending on your perspective on sports, you can, of course, I mean, eSports is not playing football outside on a pitch, but it is clearly a competitive entertainment product. So, and if many people like watching it, then it's going to be a market.
What I've been wondering and want to ask is, do you currently see trends of how esports and regular sports are going to augment each other? Because let me get back here a second. So when you consider League of Legends or Dota, those are some of the esports that attract most viewers. Then there's no real world equivalent. What we see, especially during these Corona days, is one example I just talked about earlier with Thomas, is the Formula E, which is the electric equivalent to the Formula One. During Corona, they hosted races where the Formula E pilots were racing against each other in simulators, so sim racing. And in those sports, the esports variant is pretty close to the actual thing, and especially graphics have become so good that if you have a bad internet connection, you can't even tell the esports stream from the real thing. Many other of the regular sports, NFL, FIFA, do have esports equivalents, but they're not as big, not as popular as, for example, League of Legends, Dota, Fortnite, whatnot. But still, do you see trends in the US how these two things, the digital equivalent of, let's say, the NBA, are coming together?
Yeah, in fact, I think, well, the NBA is a strong initiative with their esports, and also most recently, NASCAR is up and running. And I know I read a quote recently from one of the senior executives at NASCAR, and they're very bullish on their iRacing in esports. So I'm not too familiar with the NASCAR or the iRacing, the actual their particular niche play there, but I do understand the overlap, because I think what they're attempting to do is they're attempting to tailor it to a younger audience. So they see there's an overlap, there's a natural overlap. So it has to do with, I think, attracting a younger demographic, but I think it's also educating them and bringing them and looping them into a particular property space. So, for example, with the NFL or the NBA or NASCAR, as I noted, I think it's bringing those younger folks in and then also introducing them. So I'm sure there's carefully curated content that allows them to also be able to look at some of the larger properties that they answer to. So, for example, with the NBA, and that may attract a larger audience, and that captures them at a younger age. And I think, they start playing with different technologies, AR, VR, which overlaps with some of those things as well. I mean, which is a separate subject matter. But it's a really fascinating confluence of everything that's happening too, and especially in the sports betting space too, which we haven't touched upon yet. But I think in some ways too, I think some of the holders in this space to capture folks for eventually, whether it's fantasy sports or eventually sports betting. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but esports definitely plays a part in that commercial makeup for sure.
Yeah, I mean, again, this to me is pretty clear, and I think I think it's probably a bit where you were going with your question, Jonas. I can see that the presentations in the esports and also the gaming field are going to influence how sports is presented in the digital realm. So for instance, esports and streaming, what we are doing here, live streaming, but in the gaming community, has a very distinct socio-cultural and also style of presentation, which is super immediate. There are these highly popular people, but they interact directly with their audiences, and I think this is going to influence how, and you already see it now with some athletes engaging with their community in some live streaming formats, playing against them, and I think it is going to influence how sports is presented. So one thing, it was an idea, I think Bill Simmons mentioned it on his podcast just the other day, where he said, well, if there is only one sport going on, why can ESPN, I think he was talking about the NBA in his example, why can ESPN not show the game with the regular analyst and color commentator on the main channel, but on ESPN2 have fans of the one team, and on ESPN3 fans of the other team talk over it. And there have been some digital services trying to create a solution for fan commentary, but if you would bring it to the big screen, this again is clearly influenced by internet culture, of course, by technological possibility, but it is something that where the internet in the broader sense, not esports specifically, but the internet community, the culture there of user-generated content could influence even back to the TV, to the big screen as they call it, even though that's probably antiquated now, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, Thomas. I think, you're also seeing a movement towards, and again, I would inject the factor of COVID into this equation, because what it's doing is it's sort of forcing people to look at things from a different vantage point. But I think prior to COVID, I think it was moving in that direction, especially over the course of the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So again, you've had this real confluence of events that have really happened, which really there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different really transformational type of things that have happened that have sort of forced this paradigm shift. So to your point, I think the digital transformations, especially the movement towards digital streaming and OTT platforms, so the proliferation of OTT platforms and how that's being leveraged, and it makes a lot of sense because the cord cutting, I mean, I could break down statistics that probably bore the audience, but there's quite a bit of cord cutting right now going on with the people that essentially are watching conventional broadcast television, and they're moving into the streaming world because they sort of, I think the younger audience, the metrics that I've read support that people want to curate and look through and disseminate what they want to watch. So some of the younger audiences are also buying into or looking at streaming platforms that are, they're able to look at almost sort of like a going to sort of a restaurant, and you're able to pick out on the menu to and the cost of broadcast television is quite high. So so the mobile offerings through digital OTT platforms, and that's an interesting space too. By the way, with DAZN right now, DAZN, they're struggling a little bit, but I suspect they're probably
big troubles.
I mean, they're in play. They're going to be fine. I think others will emerge but they should be fine. But that's the direction. That's the future. That's where everything is heading.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, clearly, and I think the first step is to move to presentation on a different infrastructure, but then the infrastructure enables very new forms of presentation and very new forms of interaction models, and I think this is going to be, we are only at the very beginning of this transformation and of what we are going to see there. And I mean, of course, we don't have all the answers of what it's going to look like, but I can pretty much guarantee you that in 10 years, 15 years from now, the presentation of live sports, even traditional sports, will be different. And then, but going back a bit to the esports angle, what I would be interested in, we of course have a European perspective, and I think it's pretty well known that the driving or where esports has been the biggest traditionally is in Asia, Southeast Asia, to be more specific. I think South Korea for the longest time has had the biggest competitive esports teams. How is it in the US currently? I think I saw some bigger investments into esports teams and content companies. Is it gaining massive traction? Is it as big, not yet as big as it is in Asia, is it?
And in addition to that, do traditional sports teams like NFL teams launch eSports divisions?
Like they do here in Bundesliga, for instance.
Yeah, so there are. Every one of the sports properties are definitely exploring and looking into the esports, and some of which have even, like the NBA has a subdivision that's in esports. NASCAR, again, as I noted. I think they're all looking at it because they see the trends. They read the metrics, they read the data. And I think, to sort of answer your question, there's a myriad of different factors. So I think what you're saying is there was investments in the last 2 years in brick and mortar esports stadiums. I know Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, he's an owner of an esports team. Bob Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, several other owners in the NFL. So these billionaires and other owners of different other sports properties, I think Mark Cuban may have an esports team, I'm not sure, but many of these prominent owners, they see the upside with esports, so they want some skin in the game, so they buy and place that into their portfolio. And I think what they do is they cross-pollinate it with some of their other with their portfolio. In fact, their team. So, for example, with the Crafts, they have an esports team, but they also obviously have the Patriots, which is the number one brand. But they also have an MLS franchise as well. So, I think what they're doing is if I'm correct in my assessment, I think they're leveraging off of their portfolio of properties and realizing that some of which are actually overlapping with each other. So it's interesting to see how Jerry Jones had built up a brick and mortar esports arena. There's others, I think, in the VC space that have also poured money, and real estate folks. I know there's actually, interestingly, I followed this where there's been some professional athletes, especially over in the EPL, and professional soccer players, football players over in Europe, sort of cobbling together as part of VC money that's pouring into some of the esports space. And they're becoming participants because, they have brand recognition. So they're driving some of that content and elevating the exposure, so to speak, I think, in the esports space. And again, the metrics support it. I mean, if you look at the charts, they're on the rise. I read a report last year and saw a video from that Goldman Sachs put out that was, I can't remember the time or the notation on that particular on that content, but it really opened my eyes, especially when they're looking at it from an analyst perspective. What are the growing trends? What are the emerging technologies? Where are the investment money, seed money going in terms of VC money, as well as private equity money, as well as private investment money? And then, as you know, most of the owners of these sport franchises, most of which are billionaires, are certainly very affluent, wealthy individuals. And so, they have family offices, and they're very careful. They didn't get to be where they are by not being wise in terms of their investments. So it's no coincidence that you see most of the owners investing in esports.
Yeah, but let me tell you that I'm curious how these investments go, because it's not like expertise in one paradigm always translates seamlessly to another paradigm. And for instance, if we're talking about all these stadiums, so I know even here in Germany we have some companies who do pretty good business, pretty solid business with esports live events, but it has never taken off to the biggest hopes that I heard. But some pretty successful, that is agreed. But to me, the real upside and where esports becomes really interesting is not as a live spectator sport, but as a interactive online experience. So that is not to say I'm certainly not an expert and not super deep in esports, but I wouldn't necessarily bet that the sports stars and owners of today's top teams will also be the big players in the esports world, because I think the culture, the skills that are required are somewhat different. But we shall see. I mean,
yeah, it's a stay tuned. I mean, I think I think you're right. I think it's an evolving paradigm. I just think if anybody who's doing a deep dive on the data analytics side and the metrics and the analysts at Goldman Sachs and other investment houses are looking at this stuff from an investment perspective, they see the trend, and I think they're following closely in terms of the demographics and where that's trending, where the popular people who are following the esports space. I think you're right, though, especially perhaps even in Europe. So you're sort of running against the tide. So here in the U.S., I'd certainly say MLB, and I mean all the sports are fairly popular, but MLB, but especially the NFL is king. And so everybody in a particular demographic, all the way up in certain age groups, are pretty attracted to the NFL. I know the NFL league office has moved in the direction of looking at trying to drive some fan engagement, especially on the women's side as well. So it's interesting to watch perhaps that model, how that's going to work in terms of how they're going to drive fan engagement, particularly on the demographics, not so much, certainly on the age groups, but also on the genders. I'd be curious to see, because there's certainly female esports players I'm sure there are stars in the space. Again, I'm not an expert in esports, but they're certainly capable and probably equally as good as some of the men. So, if not better. And so it's a wide open audience. And I think in terms of commercial opportunities, I think it's tremendous. In fact, I think even in terms of the digital sponsorships side too on that, because to your point, I don't think there's going to be, although they do pack a lot of people into these venues to see some of these events, I think what you're going to see is particularly because it's really a digital play, I think it's going to be lucrative territory for sponsorship. So I know I read an article, I think it was yesterday or the day before. So there was an individual that I read some of his content, but he's part of a group that's owned by Bruin Sports Capital, Two Circles. Perhaps you know of them. They're out of London. They're very, very good at what they do, and they're a data analytics company. And I know I'm trying to remember, Garrett Balch is his name, is the CEO, and he talked about how digital sponsorships were the most undervalued, most asset in the sponsorship space. So I think he's right. I think it's I think as you see everything moving in the digital space, you're going to see a lot more programmatic advertising that's going to take place, and that's going to overlap and certainly be driven by the data analytics. And then you're competing, and you certainly have the conflicts going on, especially with data privacy, which is a very important issue in all of this. So a lot at play, but there's tremendous commercial opportunities, and I know we're in troubled times now and uncertain times, and it's difficult. A lot of politics in play as well. But the commercial enterprises, those who are creative and nimble now, I think will leverage and certainly emerge from this, which we will, in certainly a much better place.
Yeah, but by the way, I really like your sponsoring point, because if we were talking about, okay, will the esports field influence the traditional sports market, and I think sponsorships from these native digital players, how they handle sponsoring, this is certainly they will do stuff before traditional sports does it, and then they will adapt, because this business is very much a pretty traditional business yet, and like personalized sponsorship opportunities in these branded sports environments. Yeah, esports will definitely be a leader. And just to set the record straight, I'm clearly bullish about esports as well, and I think it's a given that it's going to grow, because I just have to look at, I have a younger brother, he is 20-ish, and he is watching no sports but a lot of gaming and esports content. And this, to me, clearly is an indicator the younger generation likes this content. They will watch this content when growing up. It's just, for me, it's the cynical side of me wants to say, well, I'm almost a bit wary once I see people, incumbents in a certain market, invest into certain solutions. Then I tend to believe that the solutions that get it right will be found somewhere else. That's, of course, only the cynical side. But, well.
No, I think there's a part of that that's cynical. I mean, just as a quick note to that, I mean that was probably part of my reluctance and ambivalence early on looking at the esports space. It was foreign to me. I was someone that grew up playing outdoors in sports and played every sport imaginable, whatever season it was. So it was more the conventional sports here in the U.S. In Europe, it's different. It's also it's more football, soccer driven. So I think it's a cultural thing. But I think to your point, I think the younger generation, the demographics now have just grown up with mobile devices. I didn't have a phone up until I was maybe in my late teens, maybe early 20s. So that probably dates me. But now kids are getting phones at 10, 11, 12, 13, and they're playing video games at 8, 9, 10 years old. So it's sort of a world that they live in. So there's a comfort zone in that. Whereas I followed and watched baseball, football on little black and white TVs. So it's really interesting. You get tethered emotionally, which is a lot of where I think the shift is in terms of fan engagement. It's really connecting, and the real successful people, I think, in marketing and in sports, driving some of the fan engagement initiatives for large enterprises, for teams, for sports properties, they really connect and they understand the good ones. They really do understand where the emotional touch points are. And if you can touch those, I think you're far ahead of the game. And it's really a lot of it's driven by data, and a lot of it's driven by really smart people that have really good instincts that follow the space.
Yeah, that I think that is a good point to leave esports and move on to the blockchain space. Now, I mean, we are both blockchain natives, or at least we are in the business since quite some time, Jonas and I. And you came from the legal, from the player agent background to the technology world background at your time at Publicis, and then you stumbled across blockchain specifically in the sports context. Whereas I've always been an avid follower of sports and the NBA specifically, but it was more of a hobby before starting Liquiditeam, nothing I did professionally. So I come from the blockchain side. So what interests me is what caught your interest into the blockchain world and this wide-ranging space, and why did you start to really research?
It really struck me as I was starting to research it, and I was actually approached by several blockchain startups in terms of getting involved on an advisory level. And then I think the timing of it accelerated to the point where it was over the holidays. And then I think I met you guys. So it was sort of, I was on a fast track where I really started processing and learning a lot more about blockchain. I had understood it at a rudimentary level, but where I thought the use cases and where the applicability lies from a commercial standpoint and from a business perspective, it made sense. The technology itself is an incredible, it's a versatile, it's a very nimble technology, and I think it applies to every vertical that you can think of. So I think it caught the attention while I was listening to a podcast last year. I think I was out riding a bike or running, listening to a podcast of an individual who was an executive at the NFL Players Association, where I used to be a player agent and was a member of the Players Union. So I listened to him talk about how blockchain was being used in terms of the memorabilia issues relating to a lot of the jerseys and just a lot of the NFL branded jerseys, memorabilia, etc., that you see when you go to a pro shop, you go to a football game, you buy on e-commerce. And there's a tremendous, I started digging deeper and I started realizing there's such a deep, dark market on that with the counterfeit space. That, well, what are some of the technologies now that could be used to thwart that? And I saw that as a problem before I even listened to that podcast. But that podcast really opened up my eyes and introduced me to the concept of blockchain. And blockchain opened my eyes up in terms of some of the capabilities and really the essential qualities of blockchain that allows it, through its immutable ledger and through its authentication to really thwart the issues at a very simplified level, to offset some of the counterfeit that goes on, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And I know the NFL as well as many other sports properties, as well as the shoe and athletic footwear companies, as well as the pharmaceutical industry, as well as any other enterprise that you can think of. They have issues with counterfeit. I was just reading an article about artwork. I was reading an article about a month ago about fine wines that are sold on these markets and auctions. And oftentimes, to authenticate some of these artworks and some of any of these issues, whether it's sports memorabilia, I said to myself, is there a technology that's out there that can really help sort of thwart some of these really just very cost prohibitive or commercially, they just put tremendous loss on the balance sheets for anybody that's driving these enterprises, and especially some of the stuff that's getting pumped out of certain countries that are just foreign and counterfeit. So I think that's what captured my attention. And so just to speed ahead, that's when I think I even was introduced to you guys, and we started hopping on some calls, and I became fascinated by the technology. And then I started realizing the use cases on it above and beyond. And of course, I gravitated a little bit towards the sports space because that's my DNA. And I started realizing the use cases there was a surplus of use cases. There's so many issues that we could use. And then reading some of your papers where you guys really, as I noted yesterday on my note too, when I accepted the invitation, and I say this sincerely, I mean, your papers really illuminated and educated me to the point, especially on the tokenization side. And I don't pretend to be an expert like you guys, but I see the applicability, and we've talked about it at Beasy and with some of the folks there. They're really smart, and as you guys have chatted with Enrique, the architect that's in Madrid. There's so many opportunities there that I think blockchain is just going to evolve, and I saw some statistic as well last week that supported it by some research study that said it was going to be a jump to a $23 billion industry. And I know those are somewhat ambiguous numbers, but I do believe that, and I think it's going to be a $23 billion industry based on this one report by 2025. So. Our conversations have all been I learned something every time we hop on a call, and certainly being around some of the folks that I'm associated with at Beasy, and especially Enrique, who's, as you guys know, is really truly a talented guy, and Bob and some of the others, and Mao, and so they really educated me, and I really feel that I think we're on the cusp of doing some really interesting things in the blockchain space.
Let me chime in here briefly because there are all these different use cases, and you touched upon a few of them, and there are more. Which one are you the most bullish about? Which one would you say, yeah, this could provide some real business impact on sports businesses? Is it the counterfeit protection case? Is it something at the intersection between fan engagement and tokenization? Is it more in the payment realm?
I think the payment realm is one, and I also think the counterfeit and the authentifying some of the memorabilia. I certainly, as I just spoke about, I think those are really critical subject areas. But I also think I'm more fascinated, and I think you guys are certainly more experts in this space than I am. But I'm fascinated by the tokenization and the fan engagement, which I think is really critical, especially now in a COVID world and a post-COVID world. So how are we going to leverage some of the use cases in tokenization where we can drive fan engagement? So I know there's some players in the space right now. They're in the collectible space, but I think more specifically, I think as it relates to, say, some of the initiatives involving perhaps participation even on an ownership level. I know that's something that Thomas, you and I were probably going to talk about at a later date, but I've mentioned this to some of the folks at Beasy. I've studied this. I'm noticing what's going on in the VC and the private equity space, and I'm curious to know. I know there's a lot of restrictions right now. I know the Spencer Dinwiddie case certainly was an eye opener for folks here, and certainly raised awareness with respect to blockchain. But I think with regards to tokenization, I think there's some really interesting creative ways to sort of work around some initiatives to pursue that space very aggressively, because teams are right now, they're really they're cash poor, and some of the rights deals and some of the contract issues and force majeure, and just there's so many legal issues relating to filling stadiums and the battles, and that's just, we could probably spend another hour on that alone here in the US, and I'm sure over in Europe, as I followed it, in Asia as well. Sports properties are slowly kind of loosening up, but it's also, we also have to take note of really the significance and importance of really the health, safety, and welfare of the individuals. And there's also legal ramifications too. I mean, as people wrestle with whether or not to open up stadiums and enter fans into these stadiums, or even if they're not fans into these stadiums, certainly here in the US with college sports, I think there's really some real interesting challenges that you need to look at from a legal perspective, as well as perhaps even ethical and even political. So,
I mean, it's a big responsibility, and here in Germany we have Bundesliga, who went back as the first major international sports league after COVID hit, and I mean, let's see. Not everybody here in Germany is a big fan of the reopening. I mean, for even some of the fans, that's interesting. I perceive that would be different if the NBA would be back. Okay, I don't know. There would also be a big discussion about, okay, are they using tests for players that could be used for other people? But yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting and tough position for the leagues to be in. But to get back on the point of blockchain and what it is doing. So I think let's probably untangle a bit, because you were touching two interesting subjects. One was the financing and ownership angle, which actually is what at Liquiditeam, our initial hypothesis and still part of our solution is actually an alternative financing, basically a crowdfunding solution based on tokenization. But yeah, the technology is just one thing, how to enable it. The real challenge is on a regulatory side. In the US, what we can do in Europe, we couldn't do in the US. So therefore, this is out of play. But I think the asset and digital asset space is going to happen. If sports teams have any interest in letting fans become owners, partial owners, is to be seen. I mean, they could already do it today. They would just have to be publicly listed stock companies. But I think most US franchises are not, if I'm not mistaken. But what is really interesting, and how we think about what we are building in the fan engagement space without getting into too much detail and bore the audience on the solution level. I think on the philosophical level, it's really interesting to bring together two aspects that we have in sports. One, in the European sports organization world, where as you are certainly aware, Michael, and probably many of our listeners are as well, specifically in Germany, but also in Spain, there is an association level. So sports, grassroots sports, popular sports is not organized in for-profit entities, but is organized in Germany. We call it e.V., eingetragener Verein. So a registered association that is a non-profit, usually local entity. And until recently, like 10, 15 years ago, even most professional sports teams were still in these e.V. legal entities, and they then were spun out into for-profit businesses over the last decade or so, even though some clubs are still, like Mainz is still organized as an e.V., for instance. So, but what this means is there is a very fan-centered philosophy in European sports that probably is not reflected in US sports. I think you have one team, it's the Packers, probably, I don't know, but one team is famously organized as a co-op, so fan-owned.
Green Bay.
The Green Bay Packers. Yeah. And you have a couple of teams in the UK football, so soccer, soccer teams that are organized in this way, but by and large it's different in the Anglo-Saxon sports world. But then what you have in the blockchain community, so most people talking about it might first think about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and this entire financial angle, but there is also an organizational angle in the blockchain crypto world, and this is where people start talking about DAOs, for instance, which means decentralized autonomous organizations. And without going too deep into this specific context, there were a lot of people who thought along the lines of, okay, you have all these platforms and networks in the internet, and they are super useful, but shouldn't they be public goods? And can we not organize people who are spread out all over the world to want to collaborate on something in a decentralized way, for instance, on open source software, which of course is where the blockchain space has its origin, in open source software? And could we not organize the network between these people in a different form than setting up a traditional company and organizing value creation in this? So take this mindset, which then people try to build on blockchain-based networks, and merge it together with the sports world, where you have these essentially network organizations anyways, because you have the sports team, you have all the fans, and then of course you have some legal entities in between there, but it's really the sum of its parts that makes a sports franchise successful. So could you organize these networks and the value creation in these networks in a slightly different way? And I think certainly yes. And this is just a philosophical, and then you have to turn this into solutions, which is what we are working on. But solving this problem, how can in a network digital world, fan relationships with their favorite sports teams, their favorite athletes be rethought? This is something that I think we are going to see a lot of innovation. And it can be little things, very practical things initially, like you have certain networks that create where user-generated content on a platform can be rewarded with tokens. The most famous example is Steam, the Steam blockchain and the Steemit network. It's basically a blogging platform similar to medium.com, where people can publish, and then other people can use their tokens to vote, and you get a share of this, but it's also kind of a reputational system. So there is a financial but also a reputational and trustworthiness angle that is all represented in a single token. And yeah, this is quite adaptable to the sports space.
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, you seem to have you and Jonas have an extraordinary sense of that domain knowledge, and I think the use cases on that, as you presented them in some of the literature, and I would encourage any of the listeners to hop on your website and take a look and read that stuff to really understand what we're talking about. I think one would be really pleasantly surprised as you sort of take a deeper dive into the content and understand. And I often find, even as we've been on a bunch of calls and conversations with various folks, if you're not really truly in the blockchain space, or you're not really in the technology space, some folks, it's not their fault. I think, the world is sort of moving at a rapid clip, and you have some individuals that are in positions of authority and power and decision making, and they're all exploring different ways to leverage technology because they understand that that's where the world is heading. But in particular, as it relates to blockchain and the tokenization, I really find it particularly fascinating. One of the subtexts of one of your articles, especially on the ownership side, and I think that's something that maybe we can talk about and explore further. I wonder what the possibilities and impossibilities are with respect to that, because again, some of the articles I've shared with you guys, or I've recently posted or talked about, and even with folks at Beasy, it has to do with some of the private equity firms right now coming in, the VC money, and some of the others that are sort of swirling, and they're looking for opportunities, as they should. But also, I think really, what is the grist that moves the wheel? What's really the driving force behind the passion behind sports? It's the fans. It's the fans and the players. So there's a really symbiotic relationship between the two. And I think by leveraging technology to sort of tether and tie those two together, I think blockchain in some ways in the tokenization aspect of it, whether it's through the collectibles or whether it's through, again, we've talked about a digital wallet and containing some of the issues of so many things that we can do, what one can do with that particular technology. But I also think too, as it relates to even ownership, fractional ownership of particular assets, I think it opens up a world of possibilities. I've started to read a little bit more recently about some of these illiquid assets, like real estate and the collectible markets, like such as wine and cars. And I saw something on Ferrari, and I know Salesforce, and we're partnered with Salesforce and KPMG and Salesforce. I know there's some use cases with them with Lamborghini, and it's really truly fascinating what one can do to gain fractional shares of these illiquid assets that are normally otherwise closed, really, for particular investors. So if, for example, one could participate in, say, if just hypothetically, if an owner of a team wanted to open up a 5% share of their ownership, rather than selling it off as a fractional share to someone else that's a billionaire that simply just wants some antlers to hang over their fireplace as a trophy. The fans, I think, will probably be far more, and nothing against them. I'm all about capitalism, so that's not my point. But I think it's more about the fans collectively. They're the ones who really drive fan engagement, whether they drive the commercial side of things, but it's also an emotional play as well. And if you can exercise and utilize some of the availability of blockchain and through the tokenization aspect, and again, in one of your papers, you mentioned that about buying into illiquid assets. And again, absent all the regulatory and the compliance issues and some of those hurdles, much like even to what Jonah said about the Green Bay Packers, if you go to a Green Bay Packers game, and I've been to that stadium once in my life, and I can tell you it's truly an incredibly passionate environment. Not that the Patriots and most other venues aren't, but there's certain geographic areas. But I think there's part of that too has to do with the emotional attachment that there are. It's an open team that's it's got some interesting financial components as to the construct of that team. I think the same use case and application could transfer contextually or contrast it with what could be done, say, in blockchain with the tokenization space. If an owner wanted to open up, like I said a few minutes ago, 5-10% of their ownership shares and allow people to invest in, well, then they would have the ability to chime in on draft picks and some of the things that we've talked about, some of the decision making, and they would have a voice in the mix, but they have an emotional attachment to it because they're actually fractionally owners of a sports team, whatever the price points are in terms of that entry point into ownership. But it allows them to enter into it where they're otherwise closed out. I mean, not everyone is there. Not everyone.
Certainly, blockchain enables many of those aspects. It certainly touches on the topics of fan engagement, which leads to what we identified before as one of the key aspects is some emotional connectedness between the fans and their favorite sports teams, athletes, whatsoever. With good fan engagement solutions, you can get this emotional connection. There's certainly ownership tied concepts that you can realize with blockchain in the sports context. The financing thing, I think it's pretty similar to as if you would have discussed how the internet might affect the sports business about 25 years ago. Pretty much every idea that you would have come up with at that time pretty much materialized by now, I think. Yes. Because it touches on sports in every conceivable way. But looking at the time, I think I would like to know how you see that 5G is affecting or is a trend or will shape trends in the sports business over the next years.
But just before you answer, let me point out to the people in the chat, if you have any question that you want us to address and bring up with Mike, then please shoot in the chat on YouTube and let us know, and we will certainly bring it up into the show here. But Michael, 5G.
Yeah, I mean, as people just, I mean, it's pretty rudimentary. People have probably been reading about it for the last 6, 12, 18 months. 5G is just a new technology.
I only heard it causes corona.
Yeah. By the way, I like it. Jonas has got the best seat in the house there with his Mercedes or whatever he's got. That's quite impressive. I don't know if it's that from
That's true.
In Austria, but anyways, so so 5G is just the next iteration of 4G. Really, I mean, just to break it down simply, in terms of the interconnectivity of what we use on our mobile phones. So, we're going to be buying most of our phones, whether you're buying an Apple phone or a Samsung or whatever technology. So it's just essentially going to speed up the interconnectivity of these devices, and what that's going to do, and how is that going to affect? It's going to affect us immensely in many different ways. So it's essentially going to speed up everything almost to the point where it's roughly 100 times faster than 4G, to kind of keep it simple. So just think about that from the perspective of what you can see on your phone right now. If you were to hop on your phone and Google something, it comes up like within a couple seconds, a second, 2 seconds. Well, with 5G, you're going to be able to do that just instantaneously, literally within milliseconds. So if you think about that and how it converges with, say, for example, so a lot of the stadiums now and the venues throughout the world are being configured to be able to allow fans to enter these stadiums with the thought in mind that 5G is right around the corner. It's actually it's sort of here right now, but it's just sort of like a slow roll. We're sort of competing with China right now with respect to really who's going to be the first one to really roll the stuff out at a level of expertise. But suffice to say, it's here and it's going to stay, and it's going to happen certainly within the next probably 12, 18 months, where it's going to be on a full roll. You're going to start seeing probably hardware phones that you're going to be buying more phones that are going to be 5G compatible. So with that said, how does 5G play into sports? So again, with the stadiums, you're going to be entering into the stadium. So again, you could sort of the ticket side of things with blockchain, you're going to be able to just go in. And especially even with COVID, I think we're starting to realize that everything, again, I think the core word, I think in most of this discussion has been digital and digital transformation. I think and I'm confident, in fact, I know that what's going to happen is you're going to see probably ticketless entry into most of the venues. And I think blockchain can play a big role in that in terms of the technology. But 5G will allow that, so you just essentially need your Wi-Fi. You go into a phone, you just scan the QR code, which is, again, in some ways you get biometrics that play into it. So you get iris with the eyes, and you get fingerprint and facial recognition and so forth. But this is a little different from all that. I think this has to do with simply just more like you go into an airport where you scan your QR code, and then you enter into the airport to get on your plane. And so I think what you're going to see is that similarly in the sports space and venues, and also I think it's going to play a very large role in the gambling and sports betting space. So, for example, if you look at the soccer match, the golf match recently. So, we're all craving sort of live sports content. I'm sure in the Bundesliga league there, I'm sure you're thrilled that at least there's some live content that you can watch. I know the EPL's up and running soon, and you've got the other sports properties that are up and rolling soon, and they're kind of going back and forth with contractual issues and CBAs and legal entanglements. But I think eventually when all the dust starts settling, and then hopefully once we get past this and looking ahead and perhaps hopefully a vaccine sooner rather than later, seeing some sense of normalcy, what you're going to see with 5G, and that's going to play a critical role, especially with sports betting and gambling, because with the ability of that speed on your mobile devices to enter into the stadium, so of course you got the benefit, you go in, ticketless entry, it helps with the waste and no paper, that's a great thing as well. It also cuts down on counterfeiting with respect to the tickets. But with respect to inside the stadium, once you get in there, you're able to use that at an the speeds are exponentially higher. So if you're tethered to an app, say, for example, one of the gambling operators, and once you enter into that stadium, what I found after doing some research is that 93%, I think, over in the UK or much of Europe, it does a lot of prop betting, so in-play live betting. And if you noticed with the match with Phil Mickelson and Peyton Manning and Tiger Woods and Tom Brady this past week, and I'm thrilled that they made $20 million for charity and so forth, and it was somewhat entertaining. I've seen more compelling golf, but it was certainly entertaining in live content. If you really think about it, if you looked at someone on the bottom of the screen, you notice that it was DraftKings. So they were placing odds at the bottom of the screens. So what you're going to see is that's whetting the appetite and introducing people to the thoughts and concept of prop betting, which is very common in other parts of the world. So 5G is going to allow people to do that. And they see that as especially the stakeholders in the space, the owners, the properties, and certainly gambling operators and the people that have the relationships with the gambling operators and the leagues and the teams. They see that as a tremendous revenue driver and a fan engagement driver, because statistically more people are tethered emotionally to a bet if they were to place even a $5 bet, a $2 bet on whether or not, say, Tiger Woods is going to make that 8-foot 2-inch putt, and with a downhill slope, with the odds sitting on the bottom that DraftKings placed at the bottom of the screen. And so to me, I saw that just looking at it from a business perspective. And again, I'm thrilled that we were able to see some live content and that they were able to raise money for charity. But I saw it more as also as even last year, I think there were some odds that were being played as well during that match between Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson. That's a gambling play. That's a sports betting play. That's people, the networks, who are essentially connected. So all the stakeholders are all intrinsically intertwined with each other, and so you see that as an opportunity with 5G for people to make bets similar to the way you would trade in the markets, milliseconds, where the odds and the algorithms spit out odds within seconds. So DraftKings did it, and they put the odds on the bottom of the screen. But you're going to see that constantly, whether it's at venues. So there's a lot of downtime with, say, a PGA event between Thursday and Friday, but also into Saturday and Sunday when the ratings increase. So you're going to have people at the venues themselves, whether it's the NFL, whether it's over in Europe, which they do now anyways. But 5G is just going to make it much more seamless, much faster. And so where that goes, I'm agnostic in terms of the issues regarding whether sports betting is good or bad. I mean, I personally think it's a commercial enterprise, and I think it's certainly I think it's an exciting space actually. And 5G, I think, is going to play a tremendous role in pushing that. And so you're seeing all the stakeholders sort of mobilizing and galvanizing around 5G. And I suspect in next year, probably in 2021, hopefully post-COVID, you're going to see a lot of 5G in most of these venues and stadiums, even in some of the older anachronistic stadiums that are over in Europe, I think, which is another issue. I think some of the stadiums are going to be transformed and conformed and fitted for that type of 5G technology to take place. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Does that make sense?
Jonas?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I mean, something I would question a little bit is if 5G is going to be the real catalyst for this, because from my experience, 4G internet works really well for me. I have really good connectivity pretty much wherever I am. And it's certainly enough for live betting, and even is enough for high quality video streaming at pretty much all the places I hang out. But sure, I mean, I would certainly think this is a trend that will become more ubiquitous. but it's gonna be not really a 5G triggered trend, I
So
think.
you think it's regardless of 5G or what the connectivity is?
Yeah,
I,
that's what I would say.
In Europe right now. So to your point, 93% of betting that goes on, particularly in the UK, at least from a statistic I read about 6-8 months ago, is live in-play prop betting. So you can certainly do it with 4G. I could do it on my phone, which is pretty fast. I've got the newest iteration of an iPhone. But I just think with 5G, you're going to notice that it's at warp speed. It's going to be done in milliseconds. So all it's going to do is just going to open up more of the ability of people, because once you get into these venues and stadiums with Wi-Fi and some of the way these stadiums are configured, I think there are challenges. Some people, I mean, you've been to probably a number of games. Sometimes you lose your signal. So that's the key component to all this in terms of trying to drive that. And then also outside the venues, or whether people are at bars or at their homes, they can hop on an app and they're able to bet, and they're able to do it more seamlessly and faster. I mean, if you think about it, 100 times faster. So you're pumping out through the algorithms, you're able to pump out odds on anything. So it increases the suite of services. So to your point, Jonas, I agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily going to. Well, I think it's going to be ubiquitous for sure, but I think it's only going to grow exponentially. Where I think people inside stadiums and they're going to try and attract more recreational bettors to try and drive the fan engagement. That's where I see the nexus between all.
And also, I think betting is going to come to a lot more sports as well, because so I'm based in Innsbruck, and Innsbruck is one of the extreme sports centers of Europe, I'd say, especially when it comes to mountain sports, skiing, snowboarding, whatnot. And I know actually a friend of mine that is currently working on a startup that aims to put together the extreme sports database. Because for many of those sports, there are just no data sets that allow an effective betting business to be built on top of. But there's certainly a request for it, and also the big betting platforms are looking to diversify their portfolio into other sports. And I think we're going to see a lot there with betting coming into more niche sports with a better data landscape available.
Yeah, I find it interesting that if you noticed yesterday that there was an announcement that Sportradar and DraftKings had enhanced their partnership that had already originally started, I think, back in 2018 or 2019. I'm not sure the exact date, but that they are rolling out more of a live streaming. And in fact, I think they're involved with the Bundesliga league as well. Well, it's interesting how their shares jumped 7% after that announcement was made. So, clearly the investors see the upside on that. So I don't know if it's necessarily just me. I just sort of follow the trends, and I certainly see that as sort of live events, streaming, OTT, digital platforms converging with 5G, as well as the appetite for sports betting, the content, the fan engagement, the emotional connection. It's quite a mix, and it's quite a potent mix, I think, for teams that are going to be looking to recover from this, because there are going to be tremendous losses certainly over the next 12 to 18 months for some of these sports teams, and many of which are owned by wealthy folks, so they'll survive. But there's been a lot of movement. I'm sure you guys have noticed too, not only just in the private equity space, but also even, I'm sure you noticed, because we've talked about Lagardère. I noticed one of the richest men in the world, Bernie Arnault, just purchased 25% of Lagardère. So, they sort of threw them an investment lifeline in some respects, because I know there were some investors looking at them. So, you're sort of seeing some of that, and you're seeing DAZN, as we talked about, and so some of these large brands and some of the agencies and some of the event planning components of some of these larger agencies, they're hurting. There's no live events, so they've got to find alternative ways, and so technology is really where everyone's going to turn. And those whom are innovative, even in the startup space, I believe you're going to see a lot of creative minds, I think, emerging in some of these troubled times. And I think once we come out of it, you're going to see probably some startups emerging, which will be able to really capitalize if they're creative and they're hungry and they're ambitious and they execute enough. I think it's interesting during difficult times.
Look, I just want to get quickly back to the 5G point still, because I think one especially the in-stadium experience that you were talking about, and I think that is where live betting and 5G really go well together. I mean, unless you have a stadium outfitted with the top-notch Wi-Fi, and I think even these things don't necessarily work if there are 60,000 people inside or there are hiccups. But for I just Googled it quickly. So per square kilometer or per 0.386 square miles, it needs to be 5G will be able to support 1 million devices. And then if you combine this with the bandwidth and the throughput that you get, I think even very different live experiences become feasible. I don't know, maybe you can do some 3D live betting elements where you predict where a ball hits while the ball is going on. I don't know, that is whatever. People will have to build it once the technology is out there. But in this space, I think interesting stuff is feasible.
And also with regards to sports broadcasting, because all the sports that don't really happen in a central venue, everything that happens outside of a stadium, for example, on the mountain or road bike racing, I don't know, there's going to be a lot more ways to broadcast this, because you don't have, thinking of Tour de France right now, where you usually have those two guys on a motorbike with the other guy sitting with this big TV camera and the whole broadcasting set on the motorbike. I think with improved connectivity and without the need for satellite transmission via a stationary car, then you can realize new broadcasting formats.
Yeah, of course. GoPros can be outfitted with like 5G. The drivers can have the cameras mounted on their gear without any weight, and it can broadcast, I don't know, 1080p quality signals, or probably even 4K quality signals. Yeah, 4K quality signals to this. So yeah, I think you're right. And then watching it, broadcasting it from different devices, all this will be feasible once it's here. And imagine how cool this would be to watch. I mean, okay, Tour de France with a head cam, but if you could really be on your favorite snowboarder's head when he's going downhill, would be cool.
Think about even like for example skiing or some of the sports, some of the other sports that Jonas was talking about. Like I think back, and people have asked me, and I'm a conventional sort of football guy and watch most of the conventional US-based sports, and I'm now a soccer fan as well, and my niece is a soccer player, played at the University of Florida. So I've watched a bunch of the EPL, and I've seen some matches in Italy as well. The passion with sports and soccer is tremendous. But what's interesting, people have asked me, what's the biggest thrill you've ever seen in terms of watching content on TV? And this, again, probably dates me, but when I was a little kid, I remember watching probably one of the most iconic sports figures in Germany, right? Or was he Austrian? Franz Klammer? You remember Franz Klammer, the skier? Maybe that's dating you guys as well. But take a look at, I mean, if you want to Google Franz Klammer, who was an Olympic downhill skier, and I watched his race where he was behind on a particular race, and so he was favored to win the race. He was the number one skier in the world, much like some of the skiers, Alberto Tomba, some of the others that have really flourished over the years, that are really tops in their class. I'm not a big skiing guy, but I'm just saying from the emotional standpoint, watching that race, to me, I felt so excited watching that race, and that he beat it. So they measure it when they come downhill. I'm not an expert skier, but he was behind by just fractions of seconds behind that race. And I was watching it, and for some reason, I wasn't even emotionally connected to him, but for some reason, I became emotionally connected to him and wanted him to win. If you think about that and how elevated I was in terms of the emotional nexus and connection I had with Franz Klammer, if folks out there want to Google him and watch this race when he was in the Olympics, and he won by just fractions of a second to win the Olympic gold medal, I mean, it was absolutely thrilling. And if you think about just from the gambling perspective or sports betting, people are probably will be looking at things like that where the suite of services with some of these betting operators where again live streaming, much like the way DraftKings and Sportradar and others have certainly created these live streaming events through OTT and digital platforms. I think the opportunities are endless.
Actually, do you remember which Olympics that was?
Oh boy, if I say it, I probably would date myself. I thought it was in the late
1976, probably.
1976.
You know where that was?
Wasn't it in Innsbruck?
Yep, it's basically right. Just if I would turn my laptop a little bit, you could actually see the slope.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, I was thinking about that just as I was explaining it, and yeah, honestly, it was the most thrilling. I've seen some great sporting events, been to a lot of soccer matches, been to a lot of athletic events in my life. Football, every sport. And I've seen some exciting stuff. I saw things that I could go on for 5, 6, 7 minutes about things I've seen. That was the most exciting race and thing in sports I've ever seen. So you guys should really, any of your listeners should look up in Google the Franz Klammer in Innsbruck in 1970s.
Definitely gonna see the replay right after the stream.
Yeah, definitely.
It was thrilling. But that I think encapsulates everything I'm talking about in terms of anybody who's a sports fan. And if you put aside a lot of the commercial stuff that we've talked about and how technology plays a role, it really comes down to really the emotional quotient that lies within sports. That's why we're all fans, and I think we're drawn to it. So, technology just allows us to maybe see it at a different vantage point, allows us to participate at a different level. But nothing can erase. I'm sorry, I can't buy into a lot of these stadiums now that have no fans. It's very difficult. I'm glad the content's there, but piping in fake fans and noise, that's not my thing. So.
I think that is a good point to end on. It's all about the emotional connection. But okay, Jonas, go on. Sorry.
I was just gonna say one thing. I just recently watched first Bundesliga match day after since Corona, and I thought it was quite cool. I mean, I don't want stadiums to be empty forever, but it was quite cool to actually hear the players talk and actually listen to pretty much every word that they're talking to each other, and the tactics that they communicate within the game that you usually don't usually don't get to hear. That was pretty cool.
That's really cool, and I think you get a more of a, like we talked about just in the last few minutes, an emotional connection to the participants that are playing the sports. So there's a myriad of possibilities we could do to leverage technology to draw the fans closer to some of those live talking. We saw it in the match with Nicholson and Tiger and Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. I mean, I found it more interesting, the banter between them, quite frankly.
Yeah, I can imagine. I didn't watch it. But Jonas, do you know if they put it on a delay or is it real live? Or do they have like a 30-second delay when they show it?
I don't know.
Because in the NBA, for instance, they are thinking about how they will solve it, because rumor has it that especially the coaches, they really don't want to be hurt because the stuff they say is not heard. So I would expect the NBA to come up with a delay so that the stations can filter out whatever isn't supposed to be heard by the fans' ears. Well, but yeah, in the end, again, it's about emotional connection. Technology can be a facilitator, and I also think vice versa, to reach these younger audiences who are brought up, probably they have a shorter attention spans. Probably it becomes like doing, I don't know, how long can a baseball game last? 8 hours, 9 hours, can be really long. That is
extra innings. Yeah, that's tough, and that's a challenge for Major League Baseball. Again, plays into the demographics. Why do that when you could just hop on a game and play, right? eSports.
Yeah, and I think so it works both ways. So technology and changing your format and leveraging technology is also a way for these great sports that we enjoy to still be able to connect with the future generations. And it's going to continue to be a very interesting field going forward. Michael, I thank you so much for your time and your insights. I think we could go on without a problem for another hour, maybe even 2. But I think at this point we found a good conclusion for today. Probably you will come back. And any last words for the audience, Mike? We will put, of course, the links, by the way, to your LinkedIn profile in the video description. Actually, it's already there below on the YouTube link, so they know where to find you.
Yeah, I would encourage people in the innovative space, the startup space, to continue using their minds and really challenge themselves. This is a unique opportunity for people to be creative and resourceful and industrious. So I would encourage that. And also, again, I would emphasize anybody who's a sports fan, if you can take that passion and channel it towards professional initiatives and endeavors, and if you enjoy and love what you do, I mean, I think it's a cliche, but I think that's really, really important. And in today's world, and I think given COVID, I think it places things in perspective. And you guys have been great. I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to chat. As Thomas, you just said, we can chat for another hour or two if we could, and I'm sure we will talk again soon. I look forward to eventually, when COVID lifts, to get over to Germany and attend a Bundesliga game. I did a soccer match in Germany, so I look forward to connecting and meeting you guys in person soon.
That sounds like a great plan. Let's do this. Thank you so much. Take care, and